The rope bit into Caleb Merrow's waist through 2 layers of wool, and still the wind found a way to cut past it. Smoke rolled low across the sheep pen, black against the white, and the flock was coughing. Left side. Adeline Rourke's voice came apart in the gale before it reached him. She had the lantern raised, the flame guttering behind cracked glass, and her other hand was fisted in the rope that joined them at the hip like 2 mules yoked to the same plow. Caleb couldn't see the chimney anymore. He could see the shape of where it should be, a darker smear against the barn roof, and he could feel the wrongness of it in his chest before his eyes made sense of it, smoke pouring the wrong way, folding back down into the shed instead of climbing to the sky. 6 weeks earlier, none of this would have made a lick of sense to him. 6 weeks earlier, the wagon wheel had found every rut on the last stretch of road into Larkspur Hollow, and Wyatt Merrow had counted 243 days since his mother died, and one small gray stone for each of them rode in his coat pocket, worn smooth from his thumb. He didn't say the number out loud anymore. He just knew it, the way some boys knew the names of rivers. Tabitha rode against her brother's side, 4 years old, silent. The rag doll Sarah had sewn her tucked under one arm with its yarn hair coming loose at the part. Not much farther, Caleb said, mostly to hear his own voice in the wagon box. Dusk was coming down blue and cold over grass, gone the color of old rope, and somewhere off to the west a dog was barking at nothing. The sheep ranch sat back from the road behind a fence that leaned like a tired man. A low house, one window lit amber, chimney smoke going up thin and straight in the last of the evening calm, nothing like what it would become. Caleb slowed the team without deciding to. That was when he saw the sign. It was staked crooked at the edge of the yard, the paint on it fresh enough to still smell of linseed oil under the dust. Ranch for sale, inquire Otis Vane, trading post. Wyatt leaned forward between the seats, close enough that Caleb felt his breath. Pah! There's a light on in there. Caleb looked at the house, then back at the sign driven into ground that wasn't his to sell, and something in him, old habit maybe, the same thing that made him check a Joyce twice before he trusted it, didn't believe that sign belonged to whoever lived behind that lit window. The door of the house opened. A woman's shape filled it, one hand low at her side where a shotgun barrel caught the last of the light. That's close enough. Adeline Rourke stopped on the porch step, shotgun broken open over her forearm, not aimed, not put away either. Whatever Otis Vane sent you to say, you can say it from there. Nobody sent me. Caleb kept both hands where she could see them, the reins looped loose around one wrist. Name's Caleb Merrow. These are my kids, Wyatt and Tabitha. We're passing through. Passing through, don't stop at a stranger's gate at dusk. Saw your sign. He tipped his chin toward the crooked stake at the yard's edge. Figured somebody ought to tell you it's up before you find out from a buyer standing in your kitchen. Something crossed her face, too fast to name, not surprise, exactly. More like a wound getting poked that hadn't finished healing. She walked past him, skirt catching burrs, and pulled the sign out of the ground in one motion, snapping the stake over her knee. He's done this before, she said to the sign, not to Caleb. Figured as much. She looked at the wagon then, really looked the way a person tallies up trouble before deciding whether to let it in. 2 thin children. A man with sawdust ground into the creases of his knuckles and 8 months of grief sitting behind his eyes, plain as a brand. I've got nothing to spare, she said, not for strangers. Wasn't asking for spare. Caleb climbed down slow, joints stiff from the road. I fix things. Roofs, wheels, broken machinery. Whatever's wrong here, I can likely put a hand to it. All I want in trade is milk and eggs enough to keep my kids fed a few days, maybe a place out of the wind for the wagon. Give my kids milk, I'll fix your ranch. Wyatt said it plain from the wagon seat. The way he'd heard his father say it a dozen times to a dozen doors between here and the last town. And Adeline's mouth tightened at the corner, not quite a smile, not far from one either. Tabitha had gone still. Her whole small body turned toward the barn lot where a nanny goat stood being milked by an older woman in a faded blue dress. She didn't speak. She hadn't spoken above a whisper in 8 months. but her eyes tracked the milk streaming into the pail like she could taste it from here. Adeline followed the girl's gaze and something in her shoulders came down an inch. 3 days, she said. Fix what needs fixing. Don't come in the house unless I ask you, and don't let your boy near the ram pen. He's mean this time of year. She turned toward the barn. Nettie, get these children some milk before they fall over. The older woman, Nettie Boyce, as it turned out, a widow from the next section over who came by most evenings to help with the milking, set down her pail and waved the children toward the kitchen porch without needing to be asked twice. Caleb followed the barn's shape in the last light, cataloging without meaning to. A sag in the shearing shed roofline that shouldn't be there, a grain mill standing idle with its crank handle hanging crooked. Inside the tack room, half buried under a horse blanket, something caught the lamp glow. The curved blades of a pair of shears, hand-forged, the edge gone to rust and the leather grip cracked. He picked it up without thinking, testing the pivot. This could still cut. Somebody took a stone to it. Adeline was in the doorway before he heard her cross the yard. She didn't reach for the shears. She didn't have to. Those were my husband's. Her voice had gone flat and careful, the way a person talks around a bruise. Put it down. Caleb set it back exactly where it had lain. She watched him do it. And only once he'd stepped clear did she pull the tack room door shut behind them both and turn the latch, quiet, deliberate, like she was locking away more than a tool. By the second morning, Caleb had a truer sense of what he'd walked into. The shearing shed's roof had been dripping onto last year's clip for longer than one storm could account for. A whole corner of fleece gone the color of a bruise, matted and sour with mildew, weight enough that it wouldn't sell for half what clean wool brought. He climbed up with a mouthful of nails and found the shingles rotted clean through where a branch had punched a hole. 2 winters back and nobody had climbed up to look. Why didn't Thomas patch this? He asked before he'd thought better of asking about a dead man he'd never met. Adeline stood below with an armload of split wood, not looking up. Thomas patched everything, right up until the day he didn't come home for supper. She kept walking toward the house. The roof got away from me after. He let that sit. Some questions you only got to ask once, and he'd used his. The grain mill was worse than the roof, in its way, not broken so much as surrendered. The drive axle had sheared clean through, and rather than replace it, somebody had propped the whole apparatus with a fence post and gone back to grinding meal a double handful at a time. Between 2 flat stones, the way her grandmother might have done it. Adeline's palms, when she reached past him for the sack, were calloused thick across the heel of the hand in a way that told him exactly how many mornings that had been going on. I can cut a new axle, he said. Oak, if you've got a tree you can spare. I've got trees I can't spare and trees I can. She almost smiled saying it, almost. Otis Vane's buggy came up the lane before noon, one fine bay horse pulling a rig too clean for the roads out here, and the man who climbed down from it wore his coat buttoned to the throat, against a cold that hadn't properly arrived. Yet. He had the look of a man who'd never split a rail in his life and didn't intend to start. He took his hat off, held it against his chest like a man at a funeral, which was its own kind of insult. I was passing. Thought I'd see how you're managing with winter coming on. Managing fine, Mr. Vane. Of course, of course. His eyes went past her to the shearing shed, to the mound of ruined fleece stacked to dry, to Caleb up on the roof with a hammer in his fist. Something in his face did a small private arithmetic. Only I hear talk is all. Folks in town saying a woman alone can't hold a spread like this together through a hard winter. I'd hate to see you lose the place for want of a fair offer, when I could put good money in your hand before the first snow. Folks in town say a great many things. Adeline's spine had gone straight as a fence post, though her hands, Caleb noticed, had curled tight in her apron where Otis couldn't see them. This ranch isn't for sale. Wasn't for sale when your sign showed up on my land uninvited either. Otis's smile didn't move, but something behind it did. I only meant to help. I recall Thomas thought the same about a wool contract you never paid out on. Recall it cost him near everything that year. The silence that followed had teeth in it. Otis turned his hat once in his hand, and for a moment Caleb saw past the buttoned coat and the too clean buggy to something narrower and more human. A man doing sums in his head that had nothing to do with cruelty and everything to do with fear of his own ledger going. Read if this ranch and every ranch like it folded up before the spring drives. I lose sleep over that contract too, Mrs. Rourke, Otis said quieter. More than you'd credit. He set his hat back on. The offer stands. So does the season, whether either of us likes its terms. He looked up at Caleb once on his way back to the buggy, a long, assessing look, the kind a man gives a fence he's deciding whether to jump or tear down, and said nothing at all before he drove off down the lane. Adeline didn't move until the buggy was well past the bend. Then she let out a breath she'd clearly been holding since he arrived, and looked up at Caleb on the roof like she'd forgotten, for one dangerous second, that he was still a stranger. You didn't have to hear that, she said. Didn't have a choice up here. He drove another nail. For what it's worth, that mildewed wool might not be a full loss. There's a trick with vinegar and sun I learned off a sheepman down in the river counties. She studied him a moment longer than the offer required. Why do you care if my wool sells? He didn't have a clean answer for that. Not yet. The oak axle took Caleb the better part of 2 days to shape by hand, working after dark by lantern light because daylight went to the roof and the fences and whatever else surfaced, needing his attention. Adeline took to holding the lamp for him without being asked, sitting on an overturned bucket with her shawl pulled close, saying little, watching the wood curl away under his draw knife like she found something restful in it. Sarah used to do this, Caleb said one night, not looking up. Hold the light, different lamp, same everything else. You don't have to talk about her. Don't mind it. Mostly folks go quiet soon as I mention her name, like it's catching. He turned the axle, checked the taper against his thumb. She'd have liked this place, the quiet of it. Adeline didn't answer that, but she didn't get up and leave either, and the lamp stayed steady in her hand a good while longer than the work required. Wyatt found his own way into the ranch's rhythm, a few feet at a time. First, it was watching from the fence rail while Adeline moved among the flock, counting under his breath the way he counted everything now. Then it was carrying feed, then holding a gate. On the third morning, a ewe rejected her lamb outright, butting it away from the teat, and Adeline crouched in the straw with the shivering thing cradled against her apron, working goat's milk into it drop by drop from a rag twist. He'll die if nobody takes him, she said, not looking at Wyatt, though she'd clearly aimed the words at him. Some of them the mother just won't have. Nothing cruel in it, just how sheep are made. Wyatt crouched down across from her without being told to. He held out both hands cupped the way you'd hold water. Adeline set the lamb into them like she was passing him something breakable and important both at once, and showed him how to tilt the rag so the milk came slow enough not to choke it. The lamb's whole body shook. Wyatt's hands shook to match it, not from cold. He didn't say anything the whole while. But when the lamb finally settled, its small ribs going still, and even against his palm, something loosened in Wyatt's face that hadn't been loose since the funeral. Not a smile, not quite, but its early cousin. Otis Vane sent a man out that same week, ostensibly a kindness, a fellow named Purdy, broad and slow-spoken, come to rebuild the smokehouse chimney free of charge on account of Otis's message said, the old stonework being unsafe going into winter, and him not wanting Mrs. Rourke's smoked mutton supply going up in flames on his conscience. I don't trust anything that man gives away, Adeline said, reading the note twice. Might not need to trust him, Caleb said. Just need the chimney sound. Let the fellow work, mind what he does. But minding what Purdy did turned out to mean watching a man who talked a great deal about a fireplace he'd built once. Up in the railhead town while he reset the stones at an angle that put the flue's mouth facing straight into the prevailing northwest wind instead of angled off it the way the old stonework had been laid. Caleb noticed it from across the yard and meant to say something before the mortar set. A ewe went down with bloat that same afternoon, And by the time he'd finished drenching her with soda water and walking her round the pen until she passed the gas that would have killed her otherwise, Purdy had packed his tools and gone, the new mortar already curing hard as a promise nobody meant to keep. "How's the chimney sit?" Adeline asked that evening, scrubbing the smell of sheep and vinegar from her hands at the washstand. "Sound enough for now," Caleb said, which was true as far as it went, and told himself he'd climb up and look properly once the ewe was past the worst of her trouble. Tabitha, meanwhile, had claimed a corner of the porch as her own, the rag doll propped beside her, and spent whole afternoons watching Nettie Boyce's hands move through some small chore, shelling beans, carding wool, with the fixed attention of a child memorizing something she couldn't yet say out loud. "She talked to her ma much before?" Nettie asked Caleb quietly, once shelling beans into her apron. "Talked to her more than anybody, sang to her mostly." He watched his daughter's eyes track the older woman's fingers. "Ain't said a full word since the funeral, not one." Nettie held out the bean pot without comment, and Tabitha, after a long moment's consideration, reached in and took one, cracking the pod open along its seam with a small private satisfaction, as if that alone were a kind of speech. Rain came the second week, the cold, slanting kind that promised worse behind it, and Caleb spent the better part of a day up on the shearing shed roof relaying shingles, with wet hands gone stiff and white at the knuckle. Adeline brought coffee out near dusk, 2 tin cups steaming in the drizzle, and instead of handing his through the ladder rungs and going back inside, she sat down on the shed's low step and stayed. "You'll take a chill," he said, "so will you." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "Been sitting on porches, watching men work myself half to death for 2 years. Figured I'd try sitting on one where the man wasn't half dead yet." He climbed down, joints protesting, and sat a careful distance from her on the step. The rain ticked steady on the new shingles overhead, a sound, he noted, that no longer leaked through. Thomas was building a stone bridge, Adeline said after a while to her coffee, rather than to him, over the creek at the section line, so the wagon wouldn't have to ford it every spring when the water ran high. Man from 3 sections over was helping him haul rock. A slab came loose off the bank. Thomas was underneath it. She turned the cup a quarter turn in her hands. Took them 4 hours to get him free. Wasn't but 10 minutes after that, it didn't matter anymore how long it took. Caleb didn't offer any of the things people usually offered. He'd had 2 years' worth of those thrown at him after Sarah, every one of them useless, some of them cruel in their kindness. He just let the rain fill the space where a lesser man might have said something. "I still set 2 cups out most mornings," he said instead. Once the quiet had gone on long enough to earn an answer of its own, "Sarah's and mine, pour into both. Empty the second one down the wash basin, same as I filled it." He looked at his own cup, half gone. "Ain't sure why I keep doing it, just do. That's not foolish. Didn't say it was." "You looked like you thought it might be." A corner of his mouth moved, not quite a laugh, maybe a little. Nearby, in the wet grass at the edge of the porch light, Tabitha crouched over something small and gray, turning it in her fingers. She'd taken to collecting stones the way her brother did. Though nobody had taught her the habit, she simply did what Wyatt did, the way small children copy the weather of an older sibling without knowing why. She rose, crossed the muddy yard in bare, careful steps, and held the stone out toward Adeline, not toward her father. Adeline went very still. She took it. The stone sat small and cold and unremarkable in her palm, and Tabitha watched her take it with an expression of grave, complete satisfaction, as if a transaction of great importance had been properly concluded, before turning and wandering back toward the porch light without a word. "She's never given that to anybody but Wyatt," Caleb said once his daughter was out of earshot. His voice had gone rougher than he meant it to. Adeline closed her fingers around the stone and said nothing at all for a long moment, which told him more than words would have. Up past the barn, unseen by either of them, the new smokehouse chimney stood finished and pale against the darkening sky. Its stones fitted close and its mortar cured hard, built solid, built to last, built by a careful man who simply hadn't known to check which way the wind came hardest in a Dakota winter. The flue's mouth faced due north, dead into the teeth of whatever storm would eventually come strongest off the plains, and nothing about its stonework would tell a passing eye that anything at all was wrong with it. It would hold fire and smoke perfectly well on every ordinary evening between now and the first real blizzard. Otis's man do good work, at least, Adeline asked, tipping her chin toward the new stack, mostly to have something to say that wasn't about stones passed hand to hand in the rain. Good enough, Caleb said, and meant to climb up and sight the flue against the weather vane come morning, the way he should have days ago, before the ewes bloat and the shingles and the wool had eaten every spare hour he had. I'll look it over proper when the roof's done. You've said that about 3 things this week. I know it. He drained the last of his coffee, cold now, and didn't argue the point because she wasn't wrong, and a man only had so many hours in a day before something he meant to get to slipped past the edge of it unattended. The rain kept on, soft and steady, filling the creek that had once taken her husband and running harmless past the ranch tonight. And neither of them moved to go inside for a while yet. Otis Vane's letter arrived, by way of a boy on a borrowed horse, delivered with the particular care of a message the sender wanted read alone. Adeline read it twice on the porch steps before she said anything. He's offering to buy the whole clip, she said finally, before the roads close. Says the price is fair given the mildew loss, and generous given how few buyers will make the trip out here once the snow sets in. She folded the letter along its crease, unfolded it, folded it again. It's less than half what clean wool ought to bring, then it ain't fair. It's what's on the table. Her voice had an edge to it he hadn't heard before, not anger exactly. More like a woman doing arithmetic she hated the answer to. Caleb, I don't have buyers lined up at my gate. I have you 3 weeks in mending fences for milk. Come spring shearing, if I've got no contract at all, this whole place goes under whether Otis wants it or not. So take his low price out of fear and prove him right that you can't hold this place without him. Caleb heard his own voice come out harder than he'd meant it and didn't take it back. Your husband trusted that man's ledger once. Cost him a hard year, you told me yourself. Don't. Something closed in her face, quick as a door. Don't stand there in my yard and tell me what Thomas would have done. You've been here 3 weeks. I ain't telling you what he'd do. I'm telling you what I see. He set down the hammer he'd been holding, which was its own kind of admission that this conversation mattered more than the fence. I see a man circling a woman he thinks is desperate, hoping she proves him right before spring. And if I am desperate. The words came out of her low and furious, and for a moment neither of them moved, the fence between them forgotten. You don't know what it costs, holding a place together alone for 2 years. You don't get to stand there with your dead wife's coffee cup story and tell me I'm wrong to be scared. The silence afterward had a different weight than the rain had. Caleb picked the hammer back up, mostly for something to do with his hands. You're right, he said. I don't know the cost of it. I'm sorry. She didn't answer. She turned and walked back toward the house, and neither of them spoke again that whole afternoon, working within sight of each other and further apart than they'd been in weeks. It was near dusk, the light gone flat and gray, when Caleb finally climbed the ladder he'd been putting off and sighted the smokehouse flue against the weather vane atop the barn. What he saw there straightened something cold down his spine. The vane was swinging hard from the northwest, same direction it had swung 3 evenings running, and the chimney's mouth faced it dead on, wide open to take the wind straight down its throat instead of shedding it. Adeline. He found her at the wash line, gathering in linens gone stiff with cold before full dark. That chimney's gonna kill your flock before winter's out. It catches a wind like tonight's. She looked up at the sky, at the low bruised clouds stacking hard along the western rim of the world, and something in her face was too tired, too raw from the argument still sitting between them, to take in one more warning today. Purdy built that not 2 weeks ago. Purdy built it facing the wrong way. I don't have it in me tonight, Caleb. She gathered the last of the linens against her chest. Fix it tomorrow, please. He wanted to say tomorrow might be too late. He didn't say it. He watched her go inside instead, the door shutting soft but final behind her, and turned to look west himself, where the clouds had gone the color of an old bruise and the wind was already climbing, hour by hour, towards something neither of them had reckoned on arriving quite this soon. The storm came in the night, faster than either of them had let themselves believe it would. Caleb woke to Wyatt shaking his shoulder in the wagon, the boy's face pale in the dark. "Pa! Something's wrong at the barn. I can smell smoke." He was out from under the blankets and into his boots before he'd finished hearing the sentence. The wind hit him full in the face the moment he stepped down, already a gale, snow coming sideways instead of down, and under the howl of it, he heard the sheep, not their ordinary bleating, but something higher, panicked, a whole flock coughing in the dark. Adeline was already at the pen when he reached it, lantern raised, her shawl whipping straight out behind her like a flag torn loose. "It's the chimney," she shouted over the wind. Wind's driving the smoke straight back down into the shed. There's nowhere for it to go. He didn't waste breath answering. He'd known this was coming 3 days before it arrived, and hating himself for the delay wasn't going to unclog a flue in the next 5 minutes, before the whole pen filled with smoke thick enough to drop grown ewes where they stood. "Rope," he said. "Now." She didn't ask why. She ran for the tack room and came back with the coil already in her hands, and between them, fingers half numb, they lashed it around both their waists and anchored the free end to the fence post nearest the barn. Because a man could lose the shed in this wind and never find his way back to the house. And neither of them said that thought out loud, but both of them tied the knot like they believed it. The rope bit into Caleb's waist through 2 layers of wool, and still the wind found a way to cut past it. Smoke rolled low across the sheep pen, black against the white, and the flock was coughing. "Left side." Adeline's voice came apart in the gale before it reached him, the lantern flame guttering behind cracked glass. Her other hand fisted in the rope that joined them at the hip. He couldn't see the chimney's mouth from the ground, only the wrongness of the smoke folding back down instead of climbing. He went up the leeward side of the shed roof on hands and knees, the shingles he'd nailed himself now slick with ice, Adeline below feeding him rope and holding the lantern steady against a wind trying hard to put it out. At the ridge, he found what he'd feared finding, the flue standing open dead into the gale, sucking smoke back down its own throat with every gust. He'd brought a length of board and a bucket of wet clay mud mixed with straw, everything he could gather in the 2 minutes he'd had, and he worked now with hands gone clumsy from cold, wedging the board across the flue's northwest face at an angle, packing the mud-straw mixture into the gap along its edge with his bare palms, because gloves would have cost him the feel of where the seal held and where it didn't. The wind tried to tear the board loose twice. Twice, he threw his whole weight against it and held. "Caleb!" Adeline's voice, close under him now. She'd climbed the ladder herself, lantern hooked over one arm, holding the last corner of board steady with both hands so he could pack the final seam. Ice had crusted along her eyebrows. Neither of them said a word about the danger of 2 people on a shed roof in a blizzard. There wasn't time to. The last handful of mud went into the last gap. He held his palm flat against the seal, feeling for the pull of wind through it, and felt nothing. The draw had reversed, smoke finding its true path skyward again instead of doubling back into the pen below. Below them, through the shed wall, the coughing had already begun to ease. They stayed a moment longer than they needed to, both of them shaking, both of them not entirely from cold, before working their way back down the rope to the ground. The instant Caleb's boots hit the earth, his knees went, and he sat down hard in the snow without meaning to, and Adeline sat down beside him just as hard, and neither of them moved to get up. "Sheep are quiet," she said, when she'd caught enough breath to say anything. "Sheep are quiet," he agreed. Her hand had found his at some point on the climb down, or his had found hers. Neither of them could have said which after, and it stayed there in the snow, neither one letting go first, while the storm went on tearing at everything around them and touched neither of them at all. Up at the dark house window, two small faces watched the lantern light bob and steady at last down in the yard, and Wyatt's hand, closed tight around a small gray stone in his coat pocket, slowly came open. The storm blew itself out before dawn, the way the worst ones sometimes did, leaving behind a stillness so complete Caleb could hear the barn cat crunching across the crust of new snow from the porch. He'd slept maybe 2 hours, sitting upright against the wagon wheel with a blanket Adeline had brought out and refused to take back inside for herself. Otis Vane's buggy came up the lane mid-morning, the fine bay horse picking its way careful over drifts, and Otis himself climbed down slower than usual, taking in the yard with an expression Caleb hadn't seen on him before. The flock was out in the pen, steaming faintly in the cold sun, entirely unremarkable, which was, Caleb understood watching Otis's face, the whole point. A dead flock would have told one story. A living one, calm and grazing like nothing at all had happened in the night, told another. Heard the wind took the roof off half the county, Otis said, though his eyes were on the smokehouse chimney. On the board and dried mud sealed along its northwest face, plain evidence of a repair made in the dark by somebody who knew exactly what they were doing. Purdy built that flue facing the wrong way, Adeline said. She hadn't come down off the porch to meet him. Caleb fixed what your kindness nearly killed. Otis didn't argue it. He stood a long moment with his hat in his hands, looking at the sheep, at the mended chimney, at the woman he'd spent 3 weeks telling the whole county couldn't hold this place together alone. I'll speak to Purdy, he said finally. Do that. He reached into his coat and drew out a folded paper, the wool contract, the low offer, the deadline he'd pressed on her not 4 days past. And without another word, he tore it once across the middle and laid the pieces on the porch rail, weighting them down against the wind with a stone from the step. Fair price for clean wool come spring, he said. I'll send the terms proper, once you've had time to grieve what you nearly lost. He put his hat back on. That's all I meant to say. He didn't wait for her answer. He climbed back into the buggy and turned it down the lane, and Adeline watched him go with the torn contract still weighting down under its stone, saying nothing, though something in her shoulders had eased that hadn't eased in 2 years. Out by the porch steps, Wyatt sat with his coat pocket turned inside out, 285 small gray stones spread across his knee in the thin sunlight, counting them one last time. He gathered them up slowly, poured the whole handful into Adeline's apron pocket instead of his own, and didn't explain why, because there wasn't a way to say it that wouldn't have broken something in his throat. Thank you, she said, quiet, and did not ask him to take them back. Welcome, Ma. Wyatt's easy unthinking, the words slipping out the way water finds the lowest ground. Before he'd noticed he'd said anything at all worth noticing. Nearby, Tabitha crouched at the pen rail with the orphaned lamb she'd claimed as her own these past weeks, its wool grown thick and soft under her patient hands. And when the animal butted gently against her palm looking for milk that wasn't there, she looked up at Adeline crossing the yard toward them. Hungry, Tabitha said, one plain small word, the first anyone had heard from her in 8 months, and went back to stroking the lamb's ears, like she hadn't just cracked the whole silent winter open. Adeline stood very still in the snow. Then she crossed the last of the distance and knelt down in it beside the girl, and neither of them said another word, because none was needed. Spring came to Larkspur Hollow slow, and then all at once, the way it always did, mud giving way to green in the space of what felt like a single week. The wedding was small, held in the yard between the house and the mended shearing shed. With wildflowers, Tabitha had picked herself standing in a jam jar on the porch rail, and Nettie Boyce's honey cake cooling on the sill since before dawn. A handful of neighbors came. The church bell carried faint from town when the wind sat right, and nobody minded that the bride wore her good gray dress instead of anything new, because nothing about this day needed improving on. Before the small gathering sat down to cake, Adeline went into the tack room alone and came back out carrying the shears wrapped in a clean cloth The blades honed bright now, the leather grip replaced with new-cut hide that still smelled faintly of the tannery. "These were Thomas's," she said, setting them into Caleb's hands. "I want you using them come shearing time, not put away, not remembered at used." Caleb turned the shears once, feeling the pivot swing smooth and true under his thumb, the way it hadn't the first night he'd found them buried under a horse blanket. "I'll take good care of them. I know you will." She closed his fingers over the handles with both of her own hands. "That's why I'm giving them to you." Off by the fence line, Wyatt had built Tabitha a miniature corral out of the last of his gray stones, ringing the base of the young oak they'd planted together that first week, and she was arranging a family of carved wooden sheep inside it, narrating something to herself too soft to carry. "Give my kids milk," Caleb said later, low, just for Adeline, watching the children in the new grass. "I'll fix your ranch." "You already did," she said, both. He set the shears down carefully on the porch rail, within easy reach of the season ahead, and took her hand instead. And neither one of them let go of anything else that mattered for a long while after that.